You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up, the EU proposes full embargo on Russian oil, but not all member states are on board. Nearly 200 million people face food insecurity across the world, conflict and economic shocks intensified by climate crisis. And can meditation help officials in their mission to achieve substantial climate action? We'll be discussing that with our panel. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes, and report on the race for solutions. Now, the European Union has proposed an embargo on Russian imports of Russian oil in the latest response to the invasion of Ukraine. Now, the sanctions are yet to be approved, with several member states still reliant on Russian fossil fuels. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen admitted the task will not be easy.
Some member states are strongly dependent on Russian oil, but we simply have to do it. So today we will propose to ban all Russian oil from Europe. We will make sure that we phase out Russian oil in an orderly fashion, so in a way that allows us and our partners to secure alternative supply routes and at the same time be very careful that we minimize the impact on the global market.
Russian oil accounted for more than a quarter of the bloc's imports in 2020. And while the UK and US have been able to ban Russian oil on a much shorter time frame, the EU has announced a plan to phase out Russian crude oil imports over the next 6 months. Now, refined oil will end in 2022. But members such as Hungary and Slovakia are heavily reliant on supplies from Russia, with Hungary receiving 58% of their oil from Russia's last year, and Slovakia receiving 96% coming from Russia there. Well, despite a suggestion that those countries would have an extended deadline to phase out imports, Hungary has rejected the proposal in its current form. Our Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins is in Berlin.
Well, after much speculation, announcements today about proposals to ban oil imports by the EU from Russia. Now, if this was to go ahead, the plan would be that crude oil imports would be banned in the next 6 months, and by the end of the year, imports of processed oil. A big move for EU states, who all 27 need to support this in order for it to go through. Now, before this was announced, there were big concerns about 3 countries in particular: Germany, Slovakia and Hungary. And in recent days, actually, Germany has said that it would support a ban on oil imports from Russia. That's because, essentially, since the war in Ukraine has started, the country's been working hard to try and find alternative supplies, so it now feels like it has got a backup plan. Now, Hungary and Slovakia are a different matter. They rely very strongly on Russian oil. But it's interesting because I've been speaking to activists both here in Germany and also those with links to Hungary, and they've been saying this just doesn't go far enough. The idea that crude oil could continue to be supplied for the next 6 to 8 months gives Vladimir Putin the option to find other customers. And over in Hungary, they're saying, well, actually, we shouldn't be clinging on to supplies of dirty oil from Russia. Instead, we should be looking for renewable supplies and secure energy supplies to stop us being hostages in the future.
Well, let's get some of the day's other climate news now. And a spike in oil and gas prices triggered by the war in Ukraine could see energy giants increasing their profits by 111% this year from North Sea operations alone. Now, analysts from Greenpeace and Oil Change International found the money made from North Sea fossil fuel operations is projected to increase by £11.6 billion, and campaigners are calling on a windfall tax to invest the money elsewhere.
This isn't money that we're taking out of the pockets of the oil industry, because it's money they would never have seen in the first place. Investing some of that in increased efficiency in buildings, so insulation, particularly in the UK's really terrible heating stock, but also using some of that money to train up heating engineers to make sure that zero carbon heating, things like heat pumps, can be both efficiently, effectively, and less expensively installed, and making sure that our ambition around renewable energy and energy efficiency matches the urgency of the situation that we face.
A new study has revealed the most intense heat waves ever across the world, and that several went largely unreported over the past decade. So last summer, Lytton in British Columbia experienced a record-breaking 49.6 degrees Celsius. But research led by the University of Bristol showed the most extreme heat wave, that's when temperatures were highest in comparison to the average in that location, was in Southeast Asia in April 1998, when temperatures hit 32.8 degrees Celsius. Now, replacing 20% of global beef consumption with microbial protein by 2050 could halve annual deforestation and the associated CO2 emissions. It's a single-cell protein used for food, which is typically made up of fungi, and alternative meats need less farming land. And the study published in the journal Nature backs up previous research on the impact of livestock farming on climate change. And Billie Eilish has announced she'll host a 6-day climate change festival in London next month as part of her world tour. Now, the singer's organising a series of activities, including discussions on green issues, live performances and a documentary viewing. Topics will range from green practices in the music industry to the benefits of a plant-based diet and sustainable fashion. Now, the number of people facing serious hunger across the world rose sharply last year, humanitarian agencies said in a report published today. Now, the number of people facing food insecurity across the world rose by 40 million to 193 million in 2021. Now, the three primary drivers were conflict and insecurity, economic shocks, mainly the COVID pandemic, and extreme weather, longer and more extreme drought, severe cyclones and flooding from extreme rainfall. Now, 53 countries were included in this report, and those factors played a combined role, I suppose, in the worst affected countries, which included Ethiopia, Yemen and Afghanistan. But extreme weather events intensified by climate change were the primary driver of acute food insecurity for 23.5 million people in 8 countries across Africa. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Rebecca Richards, Chief of Emergencies with the World Food Programme. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca. This is a stark report, isn't it? What are your thoughts overall?
Overall, Leah, I'm actually really surprised that the numbers are as high as they are. We've always known it was coming, and it's incredible when you look especially at climate change. It takes a long time. It's no big surprise, and there's enough technology for us to be able to look and predict at what is around the corner. But when you look at the numbers, and actually, if you look also at the impact of the Ukraine crisis, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And the bottom line is there's enough food in the world to feed everyone. So it doesn't make sense that we're in a situation where you have so many on the brink of famine. You mentioned some of the countries towards southern part of Africa. So maybe I'll just give you one highlight. If you look at Somalia, the continued below average rainfall is going to see potentially 81,000 people being pushed right into the brink towards famine this year, unless we're able to do something about it. So yes, overall, I am worried. I think the evidence is there for us to plan differently and to work differently. And it really has come to a point now where we need a multi-stakeholder approach, and we need to start taking this really seriously.
Rebecca, can you just explain to us why climate change is making the food crisis worse?
Well, it starts to erode people's capacity to cope. So if you look, for example, at the drought, many of the farmers, especially smallholder farmers who provide production for their own countries, are losing their ability to actually farm and deliver the crops at scale, not just for their own families, but for the broader country. And that gradually shrinking space has a huge knock-on effect on the economy of the country. That's just one example. You also have sudden shocks when it comes to flooding or earthquakes. These are getting worse and worse and pushing much more severely people into need when it comes to humanitarian emergency assistance. So this, when you intertwine it with the conflict, like you mentioned earlier, or if you include it also into the equation of the impact of COVID, then it just exacerbates and makes the whole situation so much more worse.
And Rebecca, briefly, this is the hardest question of all. What are the solutions?
So, Lee, you know that it's complicated and each region and each country is going to need a different type of solution. But if I could dumb it down, I think we're looking at 3 areas of work that really need to happen if we're going to see change. Number one, we've got to help to save lives, but at the same time, we've got to try to change lives. We've got to build the resilience of populations. And that means tackling the root causes of hunger at the same time that you're trying to get food to people. And that's a 2-pronged approach. It's got to happen at the same time. It's also got to happen in the same areas. The second is that you've got to plan differently. For us to make longer term change, we've got to be looking at the policies of countries. We've got to be looking at a wide variety of issues that affect the global supply chain. That's export tariffs, that's being able to move and transport. It's being able to stockpile, it's being able to store food and make sure that there's no loss of food. All these need to be considered. And then finally, you need to really bring the community together. And I'm talking about breaking down those silos and bringing together the private sector with the UN, with NGOs, together with governments to really start to change the dial and bring joint plans that have a much more longer term approach to tackling the problem.
OK, Rebecca, thank you very much for your insights. Well, do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined by Zepi Gulzari-Munro, Deputy Director at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and Asad Rehman, Director of War on Want. We'll be discussing what the global food crisis will be and what can be done, and meditation. Can it help bureaucrats tackle climate change? Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Well, let's discuss some of today's climate issues now with Zepi Gulzari-Munro, Deputy Director at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and Asad Rehman, Director of War on Want. Now, the big story that we're talking today is news that the number of people facing food insecurity across the world has shot up to nearly 200 million. Now, the reasons are, of course, complex, but it's clear that increased drought, storms and flooding are playing an important role. And in this report from 2021, it doesn't even take into account the effects of the war in Ukraine, and one of the world's biggest wheat exporters. So let me start with you, Asad. 200 million people across the globe. That's such a big number. Are you surprised by that?
Actually, I'm not. There have been countless warnings that we're now entering a period of what is being called a hunger pandemic, whether it's climate famines in Madagascar or even here in the UK, one of the richest economies in the world, where 1 in 10 families are using food banks because they can't afford the increase in food prices. We are moving from the relative stable period in our planet's history when human beings were able to grow crops, develop agriculture, and have stable civilizations. That's clearly coming to an end. And as rightly the report points out, there are many different elements to this crisis. But, what's important is for us to think about these things connected, joining the dots between whether it's climate, health, poverty, and hunger. Because what's stark about this figure is it talks about the 200 million figure for famine, right? That's acute hunger. But actually, globally, there's about 2 billion people who face food insecurity and close to about 1 billion people who will go hungry today. So they won't have enough food to feed themselves or their families. And that, of course, number is increasing. Yet, as the report says, we could feed the world 3 times over. So why aren't we doing that? Well, fundamentally, we have a broken food system. We have nearly 80% of the world, which is being fed by small farms, but they're only on a tiny percentage of land, about 25% globally, and in the continent of Africa, less than 15%. Now, your listeners might ask, So what's happening with the rest of the land? Well, the rest of the land is controlled by what is called industrial farming. Mega corporations who produce commodities for the world markets, so soy, sugarcane, palm oil. And they, like the fossil fuel industry, are intent on racking up the hugest profit they can. And they're actually responsible also for about a third of global emissions. And what we've seen is that our food systems are being controlled by these mega corporations. Just 4 corporations control 75% of all our global trade in grain, 6 control about 75% of all pesticides, and 10 companies control much of our food brands. So they decide what kind of food we eat, how much we pay, and how much damage is done. But there are solutions to this, and farmers' organisations and peasants, and we as War on Want work with many of them, have been proposing these solutions. They say, look, we can cool this planet and feed people. We can call for a global Green New Deal. We can call for food to be made a fundamental right for everyone. But we can, most importantly, tackle this food system by giving land rights to those who actually produce the food that feeds the world. So it's not a story just of doom and gloom, but it is a really important part of recognizing that this climate crisis isn't simply about fossil fuels. Okay, it's also about the food we produce.
You're not shocked by it. We'll get on to more on to the solutions in a moment. But Zeppi, I guess what this shows is that climate change is now a security risk just as war.
Absolutely. I think the critical point I'd highlight to start off with is really that this is a vicious cycle. Climate change drives food insecurity, but our means of production, the way that we use our land and the way that we produce food is also driving the climate crisis. So it is a vicious cycle. And just to give you an example of that, so for example, we know that between the year 2000 and 2018, our agricultural expansion actually drove 90% of global deforestation, which of course drives climate change. Asad's already mentioned the industrialized agriculture model, which has been said to be responsible for changing the world's surface more than any other human activity. So that's on the one hand. And then in terms of how it's impacted, our food production is impacted on by climate change, well, unfortunately, all we need to do is to look over at India, where the severe heat wave, the hottest spring on record, has severely damaged the wheat crops that actually India was hoping to export, some of which India was hoping to export to help mitigate against the supply shock as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. So it really is a potentially vicious cycle. The supply issue also obviously drives the high prices here. We know that, fertilizers need fossil fuels at the moment predominantly in order to be produced, and that's driving up the cost of fertilizers, which in turn can cause another shock next year if farmers can't afford to use what they've become used to using because of this current model of industrial agriculture, the fertilizers that they need. So it really is a potentially vicious cycle here.
Is the future bleak, Asad? Do you feel that the solutions are within reach? Is there potential to change?
So the solutions have always been within reach, and the solutions have been long proposed, and there are many organisations that have been proposing them. We've worked for decades around this issue of hunger and the broken food system and its impact on land, on biodiversity and people. And so it's not a problem that can't be fixed. But like much of the climate crisis, what it relies on is political will, and political will to take on some really powerful vested interests. Our food corporations are about as strong as the fossil fuel industry. And when we all know we need to end the fossil fuels, but yet we continue to expand our fossil fuels and leading to increasing temperature rise, we have the same situation with food. So how do we change the dial? Well, fundamentally, only we are going to be the people who can make that happen if we collectively start putting pressure, whether it's on our supermarkets,
so Asad,
on
it's
our government
people power. People power will be the key to this. Zeppi, do you agree, briefly? People power to change the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it needs multiple solutions, really. And I think that the reality is that we cannot simply try to adapt to in terms of food production, to these increasing temperatures. We know that crop yields will be significantly impacted by rising temperatures. So we do need to really address the carbon emissions and the methane emissions that are driving a lot of this crisis as well.
OK, so much more we could talk on that subject, but we are out of time on that question. Stay with me because I do have another topic. We want to talk about meditation now because it's mindfulness, really. It's something completely different. And it's a report from The Guardian newspaper that officials in Brussels are being trained to meditate to help sort of tackle the climate crisis. It involves walking in nature and developing mindfulness. Seppi, I know you worked in Whitehall for a while, I believe. Do you think this is the solution?
Well, I mean, one thing that used to strike me quite a lot when I worked 7 years in Whitehall, and I always did wonder, when there was a flood in Yorkshire or somewhere else around the country, and then you had officials sitting in central London making policies for those places. And I remember thinking, well, it's one thing to know something intellectually, it's another thing to actually experience it. And if meditation can actually help officials try to, go get outside of their own environments, actually help them think more broadly, and it's been shown to increase empathy, then absolutely, I think, go ahead, anything that helps.
Asad, how about you? Do you think this is the key to tackling climate change, or is it all about action?
Well, we need to do both, right? Changing the system isn't just about policies and action. As Seppi said, it's also about empathy and solidarity and seeing ourselves as part of the world. So I think to solve these problems, of course, we need to speak to people's hearts as well as their minds. Now, look, I've worked at both at the UN and national level, and one of the biggest challenges we've got is we've created an economic and political system that promotes short-term economic interests, right? It's all about profits, no matter what the cost. We've created ways of making decisions that put a price on everything, but often value nothing. So we know that there is a sickness in our general economy, right? We consume more and more, we're greedy for more, but we're still not happy. So how do we get across that? Well, we're all in favour of all of these bureaucrats walking through nature, and I'm glad they're doing that if they're going to make better decisions. But we all know that better decisions are made by those who are most impacted. I would love for them to actually walk through nature in developing countries, where it's the corporations and the policies of the EU that are responsible for that destruction, or let them go and actually live in the communities that are most affected by decisions. And maybe we won't have such a blasé approach to actually the seriousness of tackling this climate crisis.
Asad and Seppi, thank you very much for your insights into today's show. Well, on the show tomorrow, we'll be joined by founder of Terror Praxis, Kirsty Gogan, and co-founder of COP26 Action Plan, Chidi Oti Oba-Ahara. But do stay with us because coming up live from Westminster at The Take with Sophie Ridge with interviews from all the major parties ahead of tomorrow's local elections. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.